Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast hosted by Eric Rostad. Join him on his 15-year journey through the immortal books. He'll share what he's learning, explore profound ideas across time and cultures, and share the one thing he always hopes to remember from each immortal book.
Today I'm going to cover Plato of Athens by Robin Waterfield, A Life in Philosophy. This is book 34 from my 2025 reading list. Well, let me start off by reading a quote towards the very end of this book, and it goes like this. Human beings are naturally endowed with curiosity, and philosophy is the ultimate way of attempting to satisfy curiosity. End quote. That was written by Robert Waterfield. He is the author of this book, and he is the author of many books. I'm reading another one of his right now. It's called Early Greek Philosophy, where he ties together a lot of the pre-Socratics and the sophist philosophers. And I've seen a number of other translations that Robin Waterfield has done, and so he's quite the scholar. So I'm in the midst of my Plato project right now, where I have decided to read all of the works of Plato. So the complete works of Plato, all of his dialogues, and why not? You know, I was going to read 6 or so at the beginning. I had listed out some of his most famous ones, but it's Plato. I'm going to quote something later on where they say that basically everything after is footnotes to Plato. And so I wanted to get to know Plato, and I've really been enjoying it so far. In the 9 that I've read have really helped me to understand his ideas. And I think if I just read his main ones, I wouldn't have as good of a grasp on those ideas, just because you do see those ideas in the different dialogues, and perhaps they're addressed in a different way, or for me, just kind of seeing things over and over, the repetition of it really helps me. So I've got 19 dialogues to go, but I took a little break here to learn a little bit more about Plato. I've been reading his works, but I know next to nothing about him other than just a few facts. So I am glad I got my feet wet with some of those those initial dialogues, as they definitely helped in understanding this book. And so if you do want to learn about Plato, I do suggest reading a few dialogues first, and I'll recommend some at the end of this episode, but maybe read a few dialogues first and then read a book like this where you get to know Plato a little bit more. I learned a ton in this book, and what I'd like to do in this episode is to share what I learned. Robin Waterfield, he highlights personal details about Plato's life, his philosophy, kind of top-level details about the main dialogues and what they're about. He talks about the academy that Plato set up, the international trips that he took, some to meet with other philosophers and others to try to sway a particular king in Syracuse, to adopt the life of the philosopher. And so we'll find out in this episode if that worked or not. So he wanted to test out his ideas in the world. He wanted to test out his ideas in the political sphere, particularly. So knowing about Plato's life helps quite a bit in understanding his thoughts. And that's something I didn't really understand until I read this book. So just knowing the time and the location that he lived, the other philosophers that he was responding to, and the colleagues that he had, and the politicians that he interacted with. This book gets into all of those types of things. So this episode will have 3 segments. So we're in segment 1 right now, just kind of a brief introduction. Segment 2, I'll go into a lot of the things that I learned in this book. And then in segment 3, I'll cover the one thing, my main takeaway from Plato of Athens. For quick reading stats for this book, I like to share these just so you know how long it might take you to read this book. I read rather slowly, and then this time that I share of how long it took me to read it also includes taking a lot of notes in the book, and also pouring a lot of coffee and drinking a lot of coffee and that kind of thing. So pretty good idea of how long it might take you to read the book. It's 260 pages. It took me 9 hours and 19 minutes. I read it between November 10th and 18th. And so that was about 29 pages per day. So next up, segment 2 and the main ideas from this work. Alfred North Whitehead had this to say about Plato in 1929. The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. end quote. You might have heard that quote before. It's quite a famous one about Plato, but just this idea that the whole philosophical tradition, if you were to read any other philosophical works, you're going to see Plato in the footnotes. And obviously this idea is a lot bigger than just footnotes in a book. Plato's had such a large impact. So let's get to know Plato a little bit here, and then I'll talk about start off with his life, some of his main beliefs and teachings, the method in which he taught, highlight some of his travels, talk about the academy a little bit, and then talk about his death. So Plato's life. He was born probably in 424 or 423 BC, and that date is debated. Waterfield gives a pretty good reason why he thinks it's that date. Some people say it was earlier, and the reason he says it's probably this is there was a war going on to where, like just even a year difference, Plato would have been in the war, but it appears that he wasn't in that war. And so that's how he dates. It was 424 or 423 when he was born. He was the fourth child, and he came from a wealthy family, and then he was wealthy his entire life. But he didn't work for the money. He had an estate, and then there were slaves and people working on the estate, and he made money from that estate. So he never really had to work to maintain that wealth, but he had this estate working for him to where he made that money. And Waterfield said he was probably among the 2,000 or so most wealthy men of Athens at the time. He also makes this statement, or someone else made this statement, I believe, philosophy would be poorer if Plato had been poor. So, end quote. So if Plato had not had all this money, he would not have had the time of leisure to be able to study and spend all this time in philosophy. He is credited with inventing philosophy, and he wrote for 50 years. He wrote on a variety of topics. I'll get into some of those in just a little bit. Waterfield had this to say towards the beginning. Plato was not sympathetic to democracy because in his youth he saw the disastrous effects of rule by people who were not political experts, end quote. He also saw his friend and mentor Socrates sentenced to death. And so, one really neat thing about this book is just to see how his life circumstances, what he went through, when he was born, all that, how that all played into his philosophy. It's not just this, that there's these intelligent ideas that he put to paper or whatever he was writing on, but that this was a man who obviously lived a life amongst other people, and the experiences that he had were such that a lot of his philosophy came from that. Now let's get into his main beliefs and teachings. First, here's a statement that shows up in the intro, and I shared this on X, and a lot of people didn't particularly agree with this, but it's quite the bold statement, and it's this: "Yet we have the complete set of Plato's dialogues. Not a single word that he published has been lost." End quote. Now that's one of the people that commented on X said that's something you can't verify, so it's. We don't know for sure, but if you think of it in this sense of any work that is referenced of Plato's, we have it. Whereas when I was reading through the tragedies, there's this Loeb edition of each of the tragedy writers, and for Aristophanes as well, of fragments. And a lot of those fragments are such because maybe Aristotle quoted a part of a play by Aeschylus, and then we know that Aeschylus had this play that was called this, and here's a part of that play, but we don't have the whole play, so it did not survive. And so with the tragedy writers especially, we've lost the majority of their work. We have some great examples of it in some incredible plays, but the majority of each of the three main tragedy writers, the majority of the works were lost. And what Robin Waterfield is claiming here is that we have not lost anything of Plato's, especially if you consider what is referenced. So that's a really incredible thing. It means that people throughout time, especially prior to the printing press, thought his work so important that they kept all of them. I mean, the scribes kept renewing them and writing them out again, and they've lasted until our time, which is a really incredible thing. Another quote by Waterfield: he had certain definite doctrines or theories, perhaps. Definitive doctrines or theories, perhaps. But even they might find themselves tested in the dialogues. And that's one really interesting and important thing to keep in mind about Plato as we're reading Plato as well. And I saw this come up in the Parmenides dialogue that I had a very hard time understanding, but I understood enough to know that what Plato was doing there was looking at his theory of forms and taking a look at it and just kind of ripping it apart. So it wasn't just like, I'm so smart, here's the theory of forms, and just accept it, but he was even ripping it apart. And we'll see that when we get to learning about his academy as well. This is just kind of a theme in his life of you never just sit on these ideas, like you constantly test them. Of the 28 dialogues that Waterfield considers to be genuine from Plato, those consist of 540,000 words, which he said is the same length as the book Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. This is also contrasted, though, with Aristotle's works, which he has about 1 million words, so almost double the words of Plato. But I thought that was interesting just to know the amount of words that each of those writers wrote. Waterfield tries to get a chronology of the written works together, but what he says is it's very difficult to determine with precision. And before I started reading the dialogues, I looked online to see, what's the best order for reading these dialogues. Do we know like the order that he wrote them in? Is that how you want to do it? Do you want to do it by themes, by topics? What's the best way to read these? And what I decided to do is just to take the Cooper edition and just read them in the order that they are in there. And so they're probably not chronologically correct, but I'm doing that. He says it's just very difficult to determine. And part of that is just because Plato would write out the dialogue and then keep working on it through time. So you don't know when the final version was completed compared to when he started writing it. And, there's probably different dialogues in between. So just a chronology of his works is really hard to determine. There's not like this Barnes and Noble party they threw when the dialogues came out. So we don't know that information, but you could find a ton of different suggested orders that you could read the dialogues in. Here are kind of 4 main ideas of Plato, and they're presented as things that he was opposed to. So here are 4 oppositions of Plato. First, he was opposed to materialism. And materialism is the belief that only bodies exist. So Plato believed that we had a soul. He believed that there was a place that soul went when it departed from the body. And so he was opposed to materialism. He was opposed to the belief that only bodies exist. The second thing he was opposed to was nominalism, and that's the idea that there are no such things as universals. And so he believed in universals. He believed in the forms. He believed in these things that exist in heaven that we see glimpses and particulars of on earth. The third thing he was opposed to was relativism. So relativism is the denial of absolute values. And so he believed that there were things that were true for all time, which is very helpful if you're trying to think about such things. The fourth thing that he was opposed to was that of skepticism, and that is the idea that it is impossible to attain knowledge of anything. So he believed that you could attain knowledge and that one should do so. And he talked about it in the sense of virtue. And so here's something that Waterfield says about virtue. Virtue is not of minor relevance to happiness, as most people think, but the essential condition of happiness, and virtue is knowledge, which makes cultivation of the rational aspect of the soul imperative. End quote. So happiness and virtue tied together with knowledge, that's what makes the cultivation of the rational aspect of the soul imperative. And this really is what Jefferson was talking about in the pursuit of happiness, is this pursuit of virtue and knowledge, and tied to the soul. I thought that was really interesting, just tying virtue to knowledge, and this really goes back to Plato there. Plato also talked about the three-part soul. Here's some of his other main things: the three-part soul, utopian politics, immaterial forms, the theory of recollection, and the plane of truth. So the plane of truth is where the immaterial forms reside, and then the theory of recollection is that we encountered these forms at some point when we were in our soul. Just our soul, we weren't embodied yet. And so when we become embodied, we are recollecting these forms that we had encountered before. So as part of that, Plato believed in reincarnation, in that our soul existed before it became embodied. As far as his teaching method, the main one that we are familiar with is the use of dialogues. And here's what Waterfield says about that. We are forced to think for ourselves whom we agree with, and even to examine our own beliefs, to engage with the text and turn ourselves into philosophers, creating a second dialogue in addition to the one that we are reading, end quote. I love that description. And it really is an interesting way to present these ideas. Waterfield talks about another way you can do this is by writing a paper and just kind of stating the facts and it just being that. But when you do a dialogue, you engage the person a lot more than just a straight statement of facts. And so what Waterfield called these dialogues is dramatized conversations by an invisible author. And what I thought was so cool, he tied them to the Greek tragedies and the Greek comedies. And so they're not too far removed from the Greek plays. It's not like you've got the Greek tragedies over here and then Plato comes along with these dialogues and they're nothing like each other. Like there's an aspect of play in these dialogues. There's an aspect of drama and there's people involved. It's not just a straight telling of facts. And that really drew people in. You almost get the idea that they could almost be performed. It would be pretty dry, but there's an aspect where some of these you could perform the dialogues as opposed to just, straight reading of facts like a university lecture or something like that. Another thing to keep in mind as we are reading these dialogues is that a lot of them were probably meant for the academy. And I'll get into the academy in just a minute, but the academy that Plato started. And so they were meant to be read, but then discussed immediately. And it's interesting to think about that for many of the books written in the past. They weren't particularly written with you in mind to be sitting by yourself reading these books. They were more considered in the sense of, or the expectation that you would be reading these with others. I mean, even novels by George MacDonald, they have this element of, you would have a really hard time understanding the book just reading it by yourself. Like it almost calls for dialogue with other people as you're reading the book, or to have the book read aloud and then discussion kind of immediately afterwards. Let's see. One last thing just about his teaching method that Waterfield says here is that he wrote out of the sheer joy of it. And so you just get this idea, the philosopher is the lover of wisdom. You truly get that idea with Plato, that he loved what he did. He loved writing about it. He loved teaching it. And there's just this sheer joy of what he was doing. It gives me a smile to think about that. I want to get into his travels a little bit. So he would travel to Syracuse, and there was a part where I think they got attacked by pirates, just like crazy stuff. So he had some adventures in his life. But the reason he was going to Syracuse is he wanted to see if he could impact the leader there. And the leader was Dionysius II. And if you've read The Republic, there's this idea of the philosopher king. And here's a statement from The Republic. Unless cities have philosophers as kings, or the people who are currently called kings and rulers practice philosophy with sufficient integrity, there can be no end to political trouble, or even to human troubles in general, end quote. So Plato had this idea of the philosopher king, and here was kind of a chance to test these ideas and see if he could kind of create a philosopher king in Syracuse and then just see how things went. And it didn't go well. The the king was more interested in the appearance of being a philosopher as opposed to truly being a philosopher. So there's a little disillusionment on Plato's part there. And what was really interesting is that Waterfield ties the dates of when particular dialogues were composed based around these trips. So he says Republic would have been written before this trip. And so you've got this grand idea of the philosopher king, but then the dialogue Statesman was written afterwards. And in Statesman, you have this idea that, and this is a quote from Waterfield, you have the idea that that rule by a wise expert who does without laws is best, end quote. So you don't have this philosopher ruler of the Republic anymore. And then in Statesman, further on, you get into someone who is obeying the laws. And so in the Statesman, you got to have someone who knows how to rule, but they're not ruling from knowledge of the forms. They're ruling from knowledge of the laws, or just they're intelligent enough to know what needs to be done, whether it's by the law or not. But then you get towards the end of Plato's life, and you've got the dialogue Laws, and it says law is the embodiment of reason. Rule of law is the closest that one can get to the rule of philosophers or ideal statesmen, end quote. So at first with Republic, you've got this idea of the philosopher king, then statesman. After he's had this experience with Dionysius II in Syracuse, he realizes, okay, maybe the philosopher king is not the way to go. So he kind of tones that down in Statesman. And then in Laws, it's more, the best thing would be someone who follows the laws, because the law is the embodiment of reason. And that's the closest we can get to the idea of the philosopher king. So I just thought that was really interesting to see how his travels, how trying to put these ideas in practice, in politics, caused him to change his mind. And you can see that in the dialogues themselves. Last thing I want to highlight here is the academy that he set up. So the academy taught philosophy. This is Waterfield speaking now. The academy taught philosophy and encouraged research for almost 1,000 years, end quote. So Oxford University is not even that old, but the academy that Plato set up lasted for almost 1,000 years. They did not charge a fee. I just saw the University of Austin in Texas just announced that they do not charge a fee to study there. But you've got Plato doing that 2,400 years ago, so they beat you to that. Plato's academy is the ancestor to our current research institutions. And in fact, what we learn about Plato in this book is that Plato directed a lot of the research that took place. So he would kind of guide where he thought the research should occur. One thing that probably is the main thing that allowed this school to last for 1,000 years is that Waterfield says this school was not created for the perpetuation of Platonism. The dialogues were read and they were studied, but they were debated. They were not just, you don't just read the dialogue and then, oh, this is the truth from Plato, yay. But this is what Plato wrote. Now we're going to debate it. And that was when Plato was there. That was after he died. It was not to just put forward the ideas of Plato, but to really grapple with them. And, a lot of these ideas got superseded. I mean, Aristotle went against the idea of forms. So if it had been just like, you have to believe what Plato wrote, the academy probably wouldn't have lasted long. But with its encouragement of challenging the ideas, even when Plato was still there, that's probably what set it up for success for so long. Plato was also really big on practical knowledge. He to be truly happy, you had to put your knowledge to work. You couldn't just go to the academy, study, and just hope for the best. You had to go back into life and put that knowledge to work. Waterfield closes up the book talking about his death, and he said this: he died pen in hand, and after his death, a tablet was discovered on which he had been writing several different versions of the opening sentence of Republic, end quote. I love that. I'd read that before somewhere else, that's something that we found in archaeological digs or something. Just that there was this tablet that showed different starting sentences to Republic, and you just think of this grand work. It's probably the most famous work that we associate with Plato, and here he is, like even late into life, just considering and reconsidering that opening line. He wanted to get it perfect. And it's such a neat thing to think about. This man who wrote 28 dialogues, started the academy. We still call ours academies. So much of what he did, it still impacts our world today, 2,400 years later. And here is a man like rewriting that first sentence just to get it perfect. I love that. Next up, segment 3, I'll cover the one thing that really stuck out to me in this work by Robin Waterfield. All right, my one thing for Plato of Athens is rather silly. I'm almost embarrassed to share it, but I figure let's just go with it. My one thing is this: Plato was a man. I know it's weird, but stick with me for just a few minutes. It's easy for me to just think back to a philosopher 2,400 years ago as somebody perhaps just sitting in a room writing ideas, and somehow they survived and were able to read them. I don't, when I think of that, I don't think of the life of Plato. I don't think of Plato the philosopher. I think of his brain, if nothing else. Like his brain came up with these things and he just put them onto paper, and we can read them now. And it's philosophy, so it's dry, and it's just the transmission of ideas from 400 BC to today. But this book presents Plato as a person, as a man. He traveled. He had friends. He started a school. He was impacted by these things. He grew up in a wealthy family that allowed him these opportunities to have leisure and study and be amongst the great philosophers of his time. He knew Socrates. He knew Aristotle. He knew the playwrights. He knew Aristophanes. He knew Xenophon. He knew a lot of people that we hear their names today. And that impacted his philosophy. It wasn't just this brain putting things down. It was relationships, and it was dialogues, and it was this whole thing that made up Plato's life. And I just hadn't thought about that before. And so it's a very strange one thing. I usually don't have weird one things like this, but that Plato was a human being, and that informed his philosophy as much as the ideas and, just sitting and thinking about these things. It was the interactions that he had. It was seeing that his ideas of the philosopher king were really hard in real life, and he had to take that into consideration. And if he hadn't, he would be less of a philosopher. And so he changed his ideas. He encouraged others to attack his ideas and dialogue and debate them. He debated his own ideas. And I love that. It gave me such a grander scope of the man, of the person, of the philosopher, to where now when I'm reading his philosophy, there's more behind it. It's not just the transmission of ideas. It is a man that changed history. He changed the philosophical discussion that we've had since that time. And yeah, that's what really the main thing that stuck out to me. I know it's silly, but that was it. I want to read just one quote that comes up in this book. Plato opened up infinite possibilities for the future of philosophy. Not just for academic philosophers, but for any of us who think and who care about what we are and what we may become as individuals and as the human species. End quote. I would agree. I agree with that quote, and I think that's another thing that is really surprising to me about Plato. Just going into the Plato Project, I had read very little of Plato, and he's accessible. his stuff is hard. I've some of the dialogues. One of them I read 3 times. I still don't understand it. Others I read 3 times and I got a better grasp than the first time I read it. They're hard. They're very hard for me, but they're accessible and they're not impossible. And with whether it's multiple readings or talking to other people about them, I can get to know them more and more. It's not like such a crazy philosophy that it's hard for me to understand. And so that's why I loved this quote. He said, not just for academic philosophers, but for any of us who think and who care about what we are and what we may become. In conclusion, this was a very helpful book. It answered so many questions about Plato for me, questions that I started to have as I was reading the dialogues, but then it just gives a really good framework for considering Plato in relation to his life, his time, his friends, his professional life, his travels, his ideas. Waterfield also gives a great introduction to many of the dialogues. You at least get the main idea or argument for each of the dialogues. That's very helpful to me. I think I'll be referencing this book before I read some of the other dialogues, just to see, one, what were they around? What were they likely written around? What part of Plato's life was this written in? Likely. Again, we don't know exactly, but Waterfield presents some good arguments for different placement of those. So very helpful book in that sense. I do recommend, if you're just starting from Plato or this even inspires you to start reading Plato, I do recommend starting with a few of the dialogues first. And maybe you start with the Apology. That is a good one. The Phaedo is also very, very good. That is the death of Socrates, and the Apology is the defense of Socrates when he is sentenced to death. So both of those are very accessible. I read them multiple times, but you could just read it once and get a really good grasp on what's going on. Much easier than some of his other dialogues. So I would read a few dialogues first before you read this book about Plato. It'll just help you when you read this book. As for what's next, I am currently reading another book by Robin Waterfield, The Greek Philosophers, and that one gets into the pre-Socratics and the Sophists. So pre-Socratics is just the set of philosophers who were before Socrates, and then the Sophists, we hear a lot about them. There's even a dialogue called Sophist by Plato, and I realized when I started reading Plato, okay, Plato is referencing a number of people here, and I have no idea who they are or what they thought. And so what this book does, and I got a few other books as well about the pre-Socratics and the Sophists, this book gives an introduction to these thinkers, to these Sophists or pre-Socratics and their main arguments and thoughts. And so I want to take a further break from my Plato project to go back in time, read these pre-Socratics and Sophists, of the fragments that we have from them, many of the fragments existing because of Aristotle and Plato, and then going back and finishing the dialogues of Plato. So this obviously increases the amount of time that I'm spending with Plato, but I think it's a worthwhile investment of that time. So yeah, after that, I'll get back into the Plato project. I just have like 10 more days here of reading the great books for 2025, because in December, I have my winter break. And winter break consists of books that have piled up on my to-be-read pile. And so I'll be announcing that list probably next week. I've decided on some books to read in December. I'm really excited about that list, and so I'll share that. And then next year, 2026, I'll get started, as I do each year, just reading straight through the Bible. That will be January and February. I start on the very first page of the Bible and just read to the very end. And I use a different version every time. So I'll announce what version I'm using this year, and I'll get started right on the 1st of January. If you want to join me, it'd be really cool. I invited one of my friends to do it last year. And so if you want to join, you'll kind of see what I'm posting each day, and maybe you'll be reading the same stuff, and it could be kind of a fun thing. That's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I would love to hear from you if you've read this book about Plato, or maybe you've read other books about Plato and you have some other fun details to share about his life. Please leave those comments on Substack, which is where I post this podcast episode. That way other people can see your comment. They can learn from it. They can dialogue back. We can get a discussion going there. We could get a dialogue going. We could do what Plato wanted us to do and talk about these things. So I would love if you did that. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter, and I have a website both at Substack and just a general website as well. The keep an eye on that website. It's books.booksoftitans.com. That is where I will be posting my 2026 reading list. It's where I'll be posting what I'm reading in December of this year, 2025. And it's also where I will be posting a list of books that I'll be covering in the Short Great Books reading list. Now, my plan at this point is to not continue the online portion of that in the new year. I would usually only have one person and sometimes no people on the online version of the reading group. So I lead it in person in Franklin, Tennessee at Landmark Booksellers the second Monday of every month. I was doing an online version as well the Wednesday after that second Monday of the month, but just due to lack of interest. So unless in this next month here, you guys just inundate me with, requests to keep it going, I am going to stop doing the online version and just do the in-person version. So you're more than welcome to fly in every Monday, or if you give me enough reason to want to keep it going online, I will do that. I'll be back next week. I think I'm going to do another, or just kind of like an introduction to me. So if you're new to the podcast and I just want to talk about how I got this reading group or reading project started, how it's morphed over time, and just if you're unaware of that story of how Books of Titans got going, I thought I'd do that on the holiday week. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.